Hello, my friend. This is Dr. Adli Abouzeedan, the guy who is behind the PSMA network. And this is a special channel, the PSAM TV International, which is meant to serve the PSMA project. And I have started recording some of the episodes related to the PSMA project. I made a general introduction about the mission and the vision. And then I talked about our 5 core values: humanism, uh, morality, purity, unity, and truth. And the plan, and I talked about our position regarding uh, spirituality, or the idea of the existence of God. And then I talked about the issue of dualism, which really related to how we see whether we see a contradiction between being a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew, and becoming part of this noble global movement. Uh, and my plan was to talk about our methods, but really there is an issue which is I wanted to talk with you about. And you know, the channel is open channel, so it is both for members of the network and other people who are not in the network. So it is the nature of this channel is to take sometimes and discuss topics that are not really directly related to the PSMA ideology or theory, but it is related to issues in the world, current issues in the world that occupies people, but but is important for us to clarify our position regarding these issues. I mean, we are part of the humanity, and we don't want to be isolated. We want to show interest in the general conditions of humanity, and anything which is really related to that, anything which helps us understand the world better, and anything that is coupled to our values, we usually take stand on these things, you know. And I'm here talking about the establisher of the PSMA movement, but this is not an official position. It's my own reflections uh, as a movement. But if somebody in the movement, if any member in the movement doesn't agree 100% with me on my opinions regarding things, I really accept that, and there is no problem for me. Uh, and anybody can, whether a member or non-member, can correspond with me at the email that I post, in the information under each of these YouTube's episodes uh, that I do give every time I make a recording. So you will find the email under the uh, you will find it under the YouTube, the information. So you can correspond with me. But this is generally how we think regarding the different issues. And today I'm going to run a quick, short episode about an important issue which is really touching on humanity and touching on the future of humanity. We have an elections for the EU Parliament these days, for the coming month in May. And I want to use this chance to really reflect a little bit of, what is our position regarding the EU or the European Union. Do we feel that it is a good idea? Do we feel that it is a bad idea? Uh, how we see this kind of construct. And I want to talk about 3 points quickly. The first point is what is our position regarding the EU Union. Second, why it is important, why that position is important, what is our justification to take that position. And number three, the significance of individuals in Europe to participate in the coming elections, and how is related that to the far right. Number one, what is our position regarding the EU? And I'm talking here about our position as a movement in a collective way. Now, there may be members within the network who feel that this is not their personal position, and I have respect for that, and I don't have problem with that, and we can accommodate these members without any problem. They should not feel alienated by this, and not everything we take as a general stand for the PSMA movement should really reflect in the ideas of each member of the network, as long as he's abiding by the 5 core values and see them as very central in his life. Our position is very clear. We are supporting the EU project. We believe that the EU project is a good project. It's not a perfect project. It has deficiencies, definitely, but basically it's a good project. It is a humanitarian project. It is a project which is good for humanity, and especially good for Europe, and Europe need it. So our position is clear, and we are supporting the EU project, and anything we can do to kind of propagate for this kind of position, we will do. We see the EU project as a humanitarian project. It is a truly democratic project. Now, there are certain issues with the construct itself, and how the policies are practiced within the EU. For example, there is a lot of emphasis on the bureaucratic side of things, while on the administrative side of things, while, for example, the democratic issues, the power of the parliament in the EU is not as it should be, really, in regard to the executive branch of the EU, which are the people who are doing the policies on the ground. Maybe that would be an issue of another episode, but that's not my purpose to talk about the current deficiencies in the EU structure, which led to some really terrible crises, including, the BRICS and similar things. The second point is regarding to why we take that position and how we justify that. We believe, and I believe personally, and I think many people share me with that within the organization, within the network, is that Europe has a common destiny of getting together. In today's world, small countries cannot sustain really their economic competition. It is the current world is the world of the giants, and you can see that the real players in the world are huge powers. We have United States. Russia is a huge power, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. China is a huge power. India is a huge power. There is a lot of push in the whole world to kind of getting together. We have the African Union as a good example. In their last meeting, they are trying to get together and build a more consolidated Union. So today is the constructs of the political entities of today is focused around larger constructs between smaller nations. And Europe had really a common history. And it was for a long time a unified empire, at least the civilized part of it, or the parts where civilization started, the southern parts. And even after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there were huge countries. Europe never knew really this disintegration that we had, except in the last maybe 200 years. And there is a lot of common ground that unify Europeans. We have a common history that bind us as Europeans. There is a predominant culture in Europe, which is basically a Christian culture with influences from other elements in the European society, like the Jewish culture and what it did imprint in the European conscious. A new phenomenon in the European texture is the influence of the Muslim culture, Islamic culture, which started really to kind of affect this build up of the European personality. So our destiny as a continent is very coupled, and we cannot survive as individual countries on the long run. I really don't know. I really don't. I know. Sorry, I know that we cannot survive if we did not get in together and build something which is more common. The national kind of countries are not really today the preference. The preference is for people getting together. There is great common grounds among us Europeans to kind of get together and find common platform. And there is no doubt in my mind that Europe is great. Europe had contributed greatly to the human civilization. Living in Europe these days is very fascinating. There are a lot of components that are building Europe. There are the different religion, and as I said, even if Europe is dominantly Christian, but the Jewish elements in the European conscious has really contributed greatly to the development of Europe, and many great thinkers of European thinkers are followers of the Jewish faith. The Muslim impulse is starting really to leave impact in the cultural sphere in Europe, and Europe is the place where great ideas has originated. Europeans and European great thinkers in the 18th century, 19th century have impacted the whole world. So it is so Europe is worthy really of playing great role in the affair of the human race, and though nationalism has contributed to the progress of individual countries, it's not enough really to build the European collective power. And I believe that all the countries in Europe has a common destiny, which is the European Union, and there is no other way. And the true value of what I'm saying, or the true example of what really does it mean for people who try to negate the European concept, or work against the European concept, or work against the EU concept, is the chaos you see now in Europe, in Britain. You know, BRICS is causing troubles for Britain, not because it is not well thought of, or because the politicians who are driving that are somehow not doing their job. It's because they are trying to create artificial solution for a situation where Britain can never find itself another way. I mean, geography tells you that Britain are part of Europe. The British Isles are part of Europe. Britain is part of Europe. It can never be another thing. And on the long run, what the BRICS will do for Britain, if it went through, is that it will just detach it for a part of history, but then it has to fall down again into Europe. So any thinking of some people who try to find their destination or their destiny outside the European Union concept is really having great illusion about their geography and geopolitical position in the world. And the Brexit is a tragic example of how you fail when you try to make artificial solutions. Regardless of the stresses in our societies, in the different countries in Europe, I'm talking as a Swedish, as a Swede now. Regardless of the pressures on our national entities, we really have to fight and stand for the concept, because the concept itself, having all the European nations gathering under one banner and creating a common market and creating a common nation and creating a common country, or either in a different forms that comes from such a construct. It can be federal kind of union. It can be more loose nationalistic kind of union. But at the end, we need to have an European umbrella that gather people together, people of Europe together. And you know, Brexit indicated clearly that our destiny as individual nations in Europe cannot be found outside the European Union, or a federal form of union between the states of Europe. And there is challenges, great challenges, and there is no project of this character which have been done easily. I mean, the United States went through a lot of stresses and strains until it really emerged as a strong federal union of the United States. And anybody who's have illusion that EU project will be kind of a smooth project do not understand reality of life. And I think that's one of the things which was really wrong. Maybe the planners of the EU project did not understand that. They should have communicated that very clearly from the beginning, because they raised the hopes greatly for the EU project, and then when trouble started, people dispersed. But it is important to stay fast on the course, to keep working with the EU project to develop it, develop its democratic institutions, develop its administrative institutions, develop its executive institutions. But there is no way to go back. The future of Europe is in its unity. There is no other way for Europe to survive uh, in this world of giants. Uh, so the reasons are historical. There's a lot of common ground that give us Europeans identity, which is really, one of the things, which, I'll give you example what I mean. I like movies. I like cinema. I watch, I love watching films. And I can tell you by watching a film, if that film is American or European, there is a specific cultural background in the European films and film cinema that reflect really a certain nature, a certain culture, a certain aspects of understanding life and things, which distinguish itself a little bit from the American mentality and the American way of looking at things. And I lived in the United States before I came to Europe, before I immigrated to Europe. We have a very distinct, I'm talking now as a European, we have very distinct type of mentality and type of culture and type of coupling to the world around us, which is really European. It's true. And this European personality is not static in its nature. It has went through a lot of changes through centuries. And there was a lot of mixing between different elements in the European continent, from the southern Mediterranean, from people living at the Mediterranean coasts of Europe, through the Greek and the Roman Empire, and then in the Middle Ages, the impact from the Germanic tribes, which kind of settled in the central and eastern part of Europe. We had impulses from the Scandinavian elements in the European build up through the Vikings and their immigration to the south. The Jews and the Muslims who went into Spain and immigrated to different parts of Europe impacted greatly the cultural context of the development of Europe. The Muslims were in Spain for a long time, for 800 years, 900 years, and they really impacted a lot culturally the Western and Southwest areas of Europe, in Spain and France, and even in recent history, with the larger migration of the Muslim elements into Europe, a lot of things did change, and that is a great experiment. I really think what's happening in Europe today is a great thing, and eventually it will really enrich the European culture and the European texture. And I'm not really at all worried about preserving the high humanity nature, or the humanian nature of the European continent. And I'm very sure that the negative aspects of these cultures who are impacting Europe today are going to disappear with time. And you will get a positive impact on the European culture. I am a true believer that negative things always disappear. They will never really, they are not long lived. In a certain time in the European history, we had rise of the fascism and the extreme nationalistic thinking through the Nazi theory, but at the end, all these negative things were dissipated, and the good spirit of Europe came out victor in the aftermath of the Second World War. So I'm very positively enthusiastic. I think we as Europeans, we're going to be able to deal with these issues, and on the long run, all this pain that we are going through in Europe will really produce a far more greater Europe, a far more humane Europe, and a far more diverse Europe with a lot of wealth, cultural wealth, philosophical wealth, ideology wealth that has distinguished the European continent in all its history. That is the destiny of Europe. It was always a pot where different currents and different streams gathered together and interacted together and in a very dynamic way, which is really what has been Europe all its history. And I prefer Europe, which is dynamic and which is more alive than a Europe which is static and which is enclosing itself, and which is really which is tried to preserve nationalistic and extreme right thinking. That leads to the last point, which is why it is important for us as Europeans really to preserve and fight with all our power in all fields, culturally, politically, through propagating for the project, through caring about the project. Confirming that this is very important now because of a simple thing. There are two major streams now which is fighting for the soul of Europe, for the future soul of Europe. There are the people who want to isolate Europe from its external environment, who are trying to repulse any new input from other cultures, who claim themselves to be the true Europeans, and in their extreme view about what is European, they want to define it in a more enclosed type of thinking, more extreme type of thinking, by emphasizing the uniqueness of certain race or certain construct. And they forget themselves that Europe have never been an isolated place. Europe have been under the influence of many streams, both at the cultural level, but even as at the immigration level. Europe is built on immigration and immigrants and the if you go back to the era before before the Christ, Europe, the population of Europe is formed out of a collision or interaction between tribes coming from the east into Central and Eastern Europe, from Germanic tribes coming down into the Roman and Greek areas, from Vikings coming into the central parts of Europe, and from later in, la- in later stages from people who moved into the north and into Scandinavia. A lot of people who did great things in the Swedish societies are not original Swedes ethically and racially. Uh, Sweden has seen a lot of immigration that are coming from central part of Europe and northern part of Europe through centuries. And the city I'm living in, Gothenburg, is a city built by the Dutch. So any talking about that European nations lived as individual nations, isolated from each other's impact and from external streams is really false. So what the extreme right says that the destiny in Europe is in closing itself and not allowing for immigrants to come to the continent or claiming that the European culture or the Christian culture in Europe or the European culture in general is under siege or under threat because of the people who are immigrating to Europe is really totally false. I believe in the European culture. I believe in the strength of the European civilization, and I believe in the strength of the European conscious and cultural build up. And I'm not at all worried that these external impacts are going to have negative impact on that. I am very sure that the European culture, with its democratic transition, is able to kind of clean out the negative impulses that come from outside and take into it the good things that the external civilizations can contribute to, whether it is Jewish culture or is it whether it is Muslim culture, whether it is Buddhist culture, whether it is Hindu culture. One should remember that uh, Europe is the place where democracy is born. So it is this the part of the world which really gave the word the meaning of democracy and freedom. And that's why I believe strongly in Europe and the European civilization. And I believe strongly that it will sustain itself. At the same time, it will enrich itself by these external impulses coming from the Jewish element of society and the Muslim element of society and the Hindu elements of society and the Buddhist elements of society. And I believe strongly that the time of the extreme nationalism in the history of Europe that so its climax during the Nazi period is really an exception in the in the European history, and it's the ugly, bad exception. But that means that we who believe in Europe and believe in the European future should really do ourselves a favor by being active in doing everything to preserve the EU constitutions, the EU institutions, and the EU project by participating actively in the coming elections of the European Parliament. Uh, and we should not be afraid of facing those negative forces that are trying to break down the EU, because the alternative that are giving to the people is terrible. It's untrue and it is false. And the Brexit is a good example of the falsehood and the lies that are delivered to people about the value of the national belonging. National belonging is important. I'm not saying it's not important at all. But to trick the people to believe that that the value of Britain as a nation is far higher than the value of Britain as a member of the EU, as a member of the European family, was totally false. And the British people are paying very dear price for that. And the British politicians who supported the Brexit and they initiated it, they look like jokers today. They are the laughing stock of everybody in the world, because they tried to start a project which is really from the beginning was a false project. It was based on lies, and it was based on things that are not really true. And at the end, it's amazing about the Brexit is that at the end, the reasons for which Britain demanded to go out of the EU, which is the issue of the immigrants from the Eastern countries who are in Europe, in United Kingdom, and they claim that they are utilize the benefits, welfare benefits from the British government. The reason for that reason is not valid anymore, because Britain was forced, the British government is forced to keep these rights. So what's the meaning of Brexit? Brexit. If the cause for the or if the reason for Britain to ask getting out from the EU is this the right of the European immigrants from East Europe to utilize the welfare facilities or the welfare benefits in Europe. If the British government agreed on that, then what is the meaning of the Brexit itself? And I think if the British politicians were really honest about themselves, including the Prime Minister, they should really reconsider their whole position, because it is a false position. If Britain insisted of not giving the immigrants coming from East Europe any rights, and paid the political price, which Britain cannot pay, the politicians, the right-wing politicians in Britain, they know that they cannot separate themselves from the continent, the European continent. They know that, but they are not truthful in telling the people that. They want to get both, they want to get both of it. They don't want to pay the price of isolating itself or isolating Britain from the rest of Europe. They don't want to do that. At the same time, they are hitting their chests and see we are the greatest nation in the world, which is really, they are living in dreams. Today, Britain is completely different than the Great Britain of the 18th and 19th century. India, which is one of the colonies, one of the largest colonies of Britain, is a superpower now. So I feel really sorry, because I feel that the British people were cheated, and cheated cheaply, by right-wing talk, empty talk. And I warn my European brothers and sisters, and I'm talking to everybody, whether you're a member of the PSAM project or you're not a member of the PSAM project. I warn them from the lies of the extreme nationalist power in the rest of Europe, because the rest of Europe is the same. The extreme right elements in the European society, which try to convince us that that the national level is more important than our collective conscious as Europeans and collective belonging as Europeans, are really giving us a false picture. Brexit has disclosed that. It showed us that all these talks are not true. None of these countries who are having a nationalistic, extreme nationalistic politicians are really able to sustain itself without the support and the full backing of the European Union. Now I understand the worries of the I'm not talking about the extreme right the nationalistic right, which see any other race or culture in Europe as a threat. These are extreme people, and their ideas doesn't matter, and they should be kind of cut off politically. Uh, I'm talking about the right wing politicians, or the right wing politicians. Uh, what they promise their constitutions, what they promise their people, when they talk about that they do what they do because they care about Europe, and they don't want Europe to kind of go under because of the immigration waves that came to Europe in the last couple of years. That worrying, I understand it. I really understand it. And I am a Muslim, so I really understand what some of these politicians say. Because unfortunately, in the last couple of decades, and especially the last years, there were some deficiencies, or there were serious deficiencies in the whole asylum system, the way the Europe have been taking immigrants into its heart. Before, there were immigrations all the time to Europe, even from Muslim countries, but Islamic countries. But there were always mechanisms to deal with that in a more responsible way. In the last couple of years, because of the large flux of Muslims to Europe, and at the same time, the lack of true sound political and economic and security regulations, the system did not function well, and everybody saw that during the last crisis, during the Syrian crisis, and that is problematic, because the European members, or the European people, and I am one of them, do expect the governments in Europe, do expect the EU as a whole to be able to function well in such situation. But that was a crisis situation, that was unnatural situation. So one cannot use it to indicate that it has been like that all the time. It was never been like that all the time. And things now under control. So this vision that the extreme right is trying to give people, that there's really huge there is a huge danger of the European character and the European quality of life and the European values. All of that is really very false kind of fear, because the Muslim elements who comes to Europe, the ones of them who are unable to adapt and unable to accept the European values and appreciate the European values and really live their life in accordance with these European values, they themselves cannot sustain. At the end, they will disappear from life, and they cannot control that their children who are grown up in these countries, who are grown up in the European context, that their children they don't absorb these values and become part of the European texture. And that is what's happening. I mean, I live in Sweden. I've been living in Sweden for 35 years, and I saw what happened to the second generation. Many of the people who coming from the first generation, they try to keep their own tradition, but their children really think completely different, and they are part of their societies, and they are more connected and more loyal to their local societies. The immigrants who are coming to Sweden, I mean, most of the second generation of the Arabs and Muslims who came to Europe, to Sweden, for example, are really love Sweden far more than they don't even remember where they came from. The first generation has this thinking, but you know, all of them are in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and they are disappearing from life. So this second generation is the one which is really have no hesitation in accepting the European values and living as Europeans. And all of them refuse to go back to the original country of their fathers and mothers. Now, this process is not without pain. I know that, and there are certain numbers who did not assimilate and integrate itself with the Swedish society, for example. But really, if you take the numbers, the problem is that they are extreme cases. And because it is extreme cases, it takes a lot of media and attention. But in reality, when you have hundreds of thousands and thousands of people coming to Sweden, and thousands of them have children, and thousands of their children grow up in this country and become part of the Swedish society and contribute to what happened in Sweden. And some of them, 100, 200, 300, become extremists. Number-wise, you know, these are promilles. I mean, it's like making some drops in a river. Now, out of the security aspects, they are very dangerous, truly, and they should be controlled and punished. And I am a Muslim, and I call for the most extreme punishment for those who really commit crimes in the Swedish society. But if you want really to look at numbers, they are really very few in numbers. Most of the people, of the Muslims who came to Europe, their children are really more concerned of living in this country peacefully and assimilating themselves, and they teach their children the love of the country. And I teach myself to love. I myself, I teach my children to love Sweden and appreciate all what the Swedish society have given to my children. And their loyalty to Sweden is total. Really, I know that. And that is the case for most of the people who immigrates to Sweden, whether they are Muslims, whether they are Jews, whether they are Hindu, whether they are Buddhist. So the fear that the extreme right trying to implant in the hearts of people, of European people, is really not true. And the EU is a good project. Europe has a common soul. It has a common history. And it was culturally open in all its history. And that is what made Europe great. What made Europe great is not the isolation. It's the interaction. It's the integration. It's the immigration. It's the flux of people who came to this continent, whether from the east, whether from the north, whether from the south. And that mixing, which make us Europeans very special people, really, with all our ingredients, with all these elements in our side. So I believe in the future of Europe. I believe in the EU project. It needs development. It needs to be developed all the time. It needs to be flexible. It needs to be worked again and again and again and again until really you get to the point where it is functioning better. And as European nations, our destiny is in one. I mean, our destiny is to create a kind of political system which really encompasses all of us. There is no other way for us. We cannot survive as nations We can only survive as a continent, as Europeans. And the EU is a great project. There were mistakes and there are mistakes, but it's like any great project in the world. It needs a fix up all the time. Sometimes politicians do mistakes. And sometimes we discover in Europe that we have built things that did not sustain. Our asylum system, the immigration policies, were not as good as they should be. And the crisis, the Syrian crisis in between 2012 and 2016 proved it. But what is great about the EU project is that we overcome that and things are very calm now. We have far more control on our borders than we had in 2012. We succeeded in fixing things, and that is the important thing. The financial crisis of Greece was one of the things which threatened the southern flank of the European Union. But by good work of the most powerful members of the EU, we have saved Greece. So we meet, as Europeans, we meet challenges all the time. But as long as we believe in each other's capacity, as long as we see our destiny as a common one, we will be able to deal with all these problems. So the project itself is great, it's inspiring, and any European nation which think that it can survive out of the EU is really have an illusion about itself and about the common world that we're living today in. And Brexit is a good example of how it is wrong to try to find a future of any European country outside the EU project. So it's very important for us as members of the EU. It's very important for us as a member of the EU, if I'm talking about Sweden, is that every Swede and every person in the EU, every citizen of the EU should do his duty or her duty and getting involved actively in the EU project and the EU elections. And actually the EU election should be, in our conscience, more important even than our local elections, because it is these elections which is kind of guide our common destiny. In relation to PSMA project and PSMA network, I really encourage every member of PSMA project, every member of our network, is to contribute as much as he can or she can and participate in the elections and the parliamentary elections of the EU, because this is our common destiny as Europeans. And our position regarding the EU project, that it is a good project. It's not a perfect project. It needs a lot of work to be better, but our destiny as Europeans, as the people who are living on this continent, is to get together. And when Europe is strong, when Europe is able to get itself together, get its act together, we will be able to do more beneficial things and more good things on the global arena. Our impact on the global arena will be far more better if we were collectively together as Europeans. And I really tell you one thing, I don't believe that those politicians in Britain who really lied to the British people and told them that Britain would be great again by leaving the EU were liars, true liars. Britain is greater when it is part of the EU, and Sweden is greater when it is part of the EU, and France is greater when it is part of the EU. There isn't a single nation in Europe which can be greater if they leave the EU. Now, there are problems and there are challenges, and because the project is so huge, there will be some failures, there will be some negative impact on things, and sadly the extreme right use these problems to attack the project itself. But the project itself is a sound, it's a good project, and it really showed its value to the people. And in all the crises, I saw a program about with 3 documents about 3 crises that happened in the EU history. One of them is related to Brexit. The other one is related to the Greece financial situation. And one of them is related to the immigration flux that happened between 2012 to 2015. And if you follow that program, you show how much really we had great politicians in Europe who worked very hard day and night to solve this problem. So it's not true that EU is not functioning. But because it is a difficult project, it is a very ambitious project, there are times when there are crises. And there is no great project in the world which really problem-free. No, doesn't exist. You want an example? Look at the documentary about the Apollo program, which is the program which was designed to put a man on the moon. There were times in that program where the program was so close to fail, and people made great sacrifices for it to succeed. Apollo 1, for example. 3 astronauts perished during tests in their capsules. But the NASA learned from these mistakes and ended up achieving that. America landed a man on the moon. But the story behind that, the trials and errors, the efforts that people do, nobody knew about it. They saw only the success. And the same thing with the EU project. There are a lot of people who are working very hard to make that project work. There are a lot of politicians who understand the value of Europe being united. And they do all what they can to fix things. On the other hand, there are naive, opportunistic politicians who say things which really is not true and doesn't reflect a deep understanding of how things are in the world today and in Europe today. So I iterate again and confirm again our position as a PSAM movement is that we support the EU project. We think it's a good project for the future of Europe, and we are very sure that the stresses and the strains that is existing now within the EU is not a sign of weakness. It's just a sign that the project is difficult, that the project is trying to achieve great things, and any project which is ambitious, which is trying to achieve great things, ought to be difficult. There ought to be a lot of problems within it. There ought to be a lot of stresses within it. And the struggle today in Europe is not between immigrants and Europeans. It's not between Christianity and Islam, or Christianity and Jewish religion, or Christianity and Buddhism, or Christianity and Hinduism, which the extremes want us to believe. The competition, the struggle today is between the older powers and older thinking, which want to drive us back into the dark ages of extreme nationalism and the people who are enlightened and are looking for the future and want to really build a new world where Europeans have their own political entity as Europe, as a new nation, and there is no more evidence of that. That the Brexit, the ones who supported it, are the older people, people who are on their way to leave the scene of life, and the ones who were against it were mostly younger people who see the future of Britain in being part of Europe. And their vision eventually will win and eventually will come as a truth. And those people who support the separation of Britain, they don't know what's going to happen. They will disappear one time, they will leave life, and this new younger generation of Europe will wind again the clock and bring back the EU, Britain again to the EU. It's the destiny of all of us who live in Europe to be together. And the younger generation understand that far more better than the old people who are living in their very old memories. This lecture took, or episode took longer time, and this is the nature of these kind of episodes because they are not focused on the project itself. They are talking about other things which are related to the project itself or the network. So I really hope that, excuse me for that, but I really needed to explain things in depth. And with that, I leave you. This is Adli Abouzeedan, the guy behind the PSMA network. And I leave you with the wish for you of love and peace.